How odd that she would die into an August night. I would have thought she would have gone out in a pale, clear night of autumn, covered to the shoulder in an ivory sheet, hair found out across the pillow perfectly. Fame will go by, and so long, I've had you, fame. And all the spirit papers taking flame, an ethery agonal of soothe and rune, and knowing this, that soon my little book of incantation will be done. It was a magical, and it is nothing that I want. Stevens wrote that for a poem to be true, it must come from an ever. If you don't fathom that, then you should not be reading this. I was there, at ever, and it was mostly poignant, and it was cruel. It was a subjunctive place where touch was so particular it hurt, like a veterinarian's deep kiss, like a Jerusalem somewhere between fancy and imagination. She says her hair is thinning, thin. The flower bed is black, sumptuous in emptiness. Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf as always. Today, I'm so excited to share with you my recent discovery of an incredible American poet who sadly passed away in 2018. She was brought to my attention through this channel. I cannot remember who it was. One of you out there commented perhaps on my humble little poetry bookshelf tour and said, you need to check out LUCIE BROCK-BROIDO. Well, you were absolutely right. This is some of the most dazzling, stunning, evocative, magical poetry that I've read in a long time. Her first collection is A Hunger. Then the Master Letters, which takes its cue from the eponymous letters that Emily Dickinson wrote. Trouble in Mind, which takes cues from Wallace Stevens's discarded titles in one of his notebooks. And finally, her last collection published in 2013, Stay Illusion. All of these are in print and available from Alfred A. Knopf. In her review of Stay Illusion, Helen Vendler, who was a colleague of LUCIE BROCK-BROIDO's at Harvard for a time, says that to read her is to learn about alternate versions of English. And indeed, Brock-BROIDO creates a tapestry of the entire English lexicon from the Middle Ages, even touching classical period, through the Middle Ages, and up to jargon of the late 20th century and early 21st century. It's a simple observation, but it needs to be reiterated. And so I'm glad Vendler also pointed out that once the title of the poem has been absorbed, the first line of the poem again stops the eye. And I noticed that during the entire time that I was reading through all of these collections of poetry. The titles are a journalist's dream. They seize attention. But then somehow the very first line does it all over again, almost without fail. It's an exception that this won't happen. As Hannah Eisenman points out in The New Yorker, even Brock-BROIDO's more overtly political poems bear qualities of the whimsical, the fabulous, the incantatory. In the Paris Review, Stephanie Burt, who studied under Brock-BROIDO, has a piece called To the Future Readers of LUCIE BROCK-BROIDO. Just to read the poetry is to see, in its hypermetric lines, its cliff face line breaks, its, and here she quotes Brock-BROIDO, gathering of foxes oddly standing still in the milk broth of oblivion. How there was more to her and more in the poetry, more to consider before reflecting, beautiful, and more to gather into the self for reflection than most poets and most poetry have in store. In Richard Sandemere's obituary for Brock-BROIDO in the New York Times, he says that she's a fearless, evocative, and playful stylist. The poet Stanley Kunitz once praised for her brilliant nervosity and taste for the fantastic. Tracy K. Smith, who at this time was the current United States Poet Laureate and also a former student of Brock-BROIDO's at Columbia University, said that she was just a full-force, wonderful presence for creativity, magic, belief, and reverence for poetry. And Sandemere points out that Brock-BROIDO herself called her style something simpler, feral. Her editor at Knopf, Deborah Garrison, said, she didn't finally rest on her ability to create gorgeous decoration. She could have done so easily, but Brock-BROIDO went deeper into herself, into grief, and into the hard work of growing older. Brock-BROIDO taught for many years at Bennington College, Princeton University, Harvard, and most recently at Columbia University, where she was the director of the poetry program and, as ever, a beloved teacher and friend. In the memoriam to Brock-BROIDO in Columbia magazine from Paul Hahn, he records Tracy K. Smith at the memorial ceremony as saying, "This small, thin woman contains universes." And the poet Emily Frigo said, "Everything was heightened about her." The then poet laureate of Los Angeles, Carol Muskie Dukes, who was also very close and enamored of Lucie Brock-BROIDO, wrote in the Los Angeles Times that, like Keats's Nightingale, one thought of her as Lucie Brock-BROIDO as far too alive to die. Or, as the monumental ode has it, "Thou was not born for death, immortal bird." Muskie Dukes says that Brock-BROIDO was a legendary insomniac. She stayed up, owlish, each night till dawn. It was not unusual to receive, on either coast, a phone call at 3 or 4 a.m. from Lucie, revved up and ready to converse in and out of the wee hours. Interior life and the outside world were mediated by what she called the skin of poetry, which floated between inner and outer reality. Poetry was to Lucie a living, breathing membrane. Her messages to the world traveled through this skin and back. I went into this cold, as I normally do. I didn't read any of the reviews or criticism or anything like that. I just took the person's comment about this Lucie Brock-BROIDO and ordered the first volume. After the first couple of poems, I ordered the remaining 3 volumes that are available. Several weeks of just living in this world that's affected by BROIDO's mystical, extravagant, alchemical, celestial, and terrestrial, heightened, emphatic, rich, deep, exuberantly stylized poems. In the opening pages of her first collection, A Hunger, I jotted down some recurring themes or phrases and words, and what I came out with at the end was creature, myth, anima and animus, finger bones, moonlight, blue, alchemy, mysticism, and ritual. There are such memorable lines as, "If I have some important thing to say, I hope I live here long enough to say it gracefully." That also bespeaks this recurring theme of being both haunted by and enchanted by death, impending doom, suicide. She's drawn to these liminal areas between life and death. She's drawn to real life stories of an infant who fell down into a well and wasn't discovered until about 60 hours later, still alive. And Brock-BROIDO puts on the mind and voice of that infant. There's thus an incantatory and elegiac and dithyramb type quality to most of her poems. Such short lines as, "I have gone into the fire and lived there." And this from a sort of prose poem called 10 Years Apprenticeship in Fantasy. "As I approach evening, I wait for the sound of stars crackling. I have never heard this noise, not yet. I imagine it is never cool there in the long, bright, monolithic hour of each star. It tickles me, actually, that this light received expired long before I ever spoke, like this letter, which, if passed from hand to hand, will reach you long after I am gone. This moment will continue for as long as you imagine me, until the star goes blank and quivers, until it becomes vividly cool, possessed by an old gravity and falls." These will stick with you. They attach themselves to your mind. Some of her imagery is so beautiful, it's almost excruciating. She says, "One finger bone of moonlight reaches in, tapping on the lock of her face." In her poem, The Future as a Cow, she says, "From the great warm side of the animal heaving with meat, as she breathes out, the day tightens to this rare night." From the poem, What the Whales Sound Like in Manhattan, The sun was setting like the reigns of emperors gone obsolete. It was a sunset of a certain alchemy of oranges, with the blues of bruises healing. In her very first collection, A Hunger, right from the start, Lucie Brock-BROIDO asserts herself as a master of poetry, which to me means someone who can channel something deep within the world and register it on the level of something deep within herself and somehow convey this in language. The next collection, The Master Letters, again, this takes its cue from the eponymous master letters, the three master letters that Emily Dickinson wrote to this unknown figure. What Brock-BROIDO does with this collection is summed up in her line from You Can't Always Get What You Want, where she says, I have been to the ruins and come back with art. In this collection, we also start to get, or rather reaffirm, this sense that Broido longs for an earlier age when mysticism and magic and alchemists, these things were accepted and lent themselves to something unquantifiable and unqualifiable in life, but yet spurs people like Brock-BROIDO on to reach out and stretch and just try. She says there are no sorcerers left, only mechanics to fix things as they break down. And this, for Broido, is lamentable. She takes on the persona of both the master and the supplicant. In this little book of incantation, we register such themes and images as window, glass, rain, April, breath, autumn, rust, shepherd, fire, frost, desire, compulsion, submission, and pageantry. She has such striking lines as, I press my face against the Apriled rainy glass, rose at the throat, rose at the windlass porthole, radiant mullion at the wheel window's wheel. I'm listening to the fluorescent light come on in April, flinging a hot white scarf across a month modeled by the chemicals of Eastern Standard Time, in the spokes of wheels of hormones turning in an unseasoned sky. The heart's clean home. A thought is a fire's phantom snuffed last night. And in that line, you can hear that Emily Dickinson calling out through the ages. In one of these letters, titled To a Strange Fashion of Forsaking, and specifies that it was written in late winter, the writer says, I write to you from an hour of broad linguistic flux, dialects of north and south mingling, the iodine of the east diminishing, leaving its rust stain to the voice. In the frozen ground, the earth apples lie like unborn calves. You are older than you used to be. And later in the same poem or letter, the short phrase, storm excites me. Lucie Brock-BROIDO was clear in several interviews that she loved to write poetry in dreary weather. Her next collection, Trouble in Mind, again takes its cue from Wallace Stevens. In fact, it's in this book called A Poet's Growth, where he traces out the artistic development of Wallace Stevens, and he also includes in whole a couple of the notebooks of Stevens's that had these discarded titles, or rather these titles that were never actually used. Well, Brock-BROIDO takes those and uses them to magisterial effect. Here we have seasons, heaviness, still life, self-portrait, violence, dreams, death, and again, autumn and rain. This was the first collection where I noticed this deliberate structuring of the collections. Here we have 5 sections of 10 poems each. And in Stay Illusion, we'll have 4 sections of 16 poems each. So for all of her mystical heightening, her celestial arcing, there is organization and tight structure. And this also comes out in the lines of her poetry. She's been recorded as saying that in her time at Johns Hopkins, when she studied under the poet Richard Howard, he was pretty clear with her that she had trouble with lines. And it seems that that admonishment really stuck with her and drove her to become this meticulous stylist. From the notes in the back of this collection, you see that her influences are Rilke, Berryman, Lucy Greeley, to whom the entire collection is dedicated, Frank Bidart, and her teacher, Richard Howard. The land there was all as peaceful as an aspirin, as the West Bank is an eternal circle of chalk and bruise and war. I read those lines, in fact, for the first time on a plane bound for Tel Aviv. The whole collection, Trouble in Mind, was with me during my time there, and I reached for it each night. And so I have to openly admit that there's definitely a personal intertwining here with these poems in particular. But I would go so far as to guarantee that because of the power and impact and humanness of these poems, they will not fail to make a personal impact with every one of you, no matter where you are. Again, in this collection, we get that Brock-BROIDO who's yearning for an older, more magical time. In her poem, Fragment on Dissembling, she says, "Once, to make of nothing something was divine. To have made of something nothing was sublime." At the end of her poem, Physicism, she says, "We live in a black and white material and motherless beneath the concavity of the sky, phenomenal on the long aortic pulse of equinox. A Sumerian describes his stars collectively as flock, and it is heavenly to him. Here, there is no heaven here." I wish I could sit here and just read every one of her poems because they're so enjoyable to read and because I want all of you to hear them. But I would suggest that you go and seek out her interview with Michael Silverblatt on Bookworm about this collection, Trouble in Mind, because she herself reads the opening poem called The Halo That Would Not Light, and it's beautiful. I'll just read an excerpt of it. "As certain and invisible as red scarves silking endlessly from a magician's hollow hat, and the spectacular catastrophe of your endless childhood is done." From Self-Portrait on the Grassy Knoll, "The school guard in her yellow slicker crossing us toward home too early in that afternoon. In rain, some honeybees in a field of mustard seed, flickering like radium or memory. Wait, anemic slippery light, let me hold onto your shadows as I would hold onto the hem of the sorcerer's tatted cloak after he has given up the ghost, departing this one room for the world of fact and time and black and white." Broido desperately wants to hold on to that sorcerer's cloak. In her poem Gamine, which comes from the French for a young, attractive, sort of boyish woman, in this poem she exchanges her Baroque grandeur for the force of clear commands. "Heart, be clean. Fists, be open, numb. Most lovely, lovely, let me be wrong in almost everything." I have to go ahead and read the entire poem, Self-Portrait with Her Hair on Fire. "Now, it is as dark as the pathos of pushing a wheelchair through the museum of a great metropolis. I cannot tell you this, not now, not ever. Even in the letter I have written that is so epic that if you were to open it, the pages would sail out in the wind like confection moths being born in the thousands out of their sacks, blowing away page by page in a wind the color of her hair across a medieval pillow endlessly scorched. The singe of something living tinged with fire. I will go on loving as I love the backs of things and the invisible, as I love the hideous, or an attention so attentive it is next to worshiping." This sums up Broido as she comes through in her poetry quite well. Not only the beauty of the language, but that tension between the sacred and the profane, or the ugly and the beautiful. She's very drawn to flaws and things that are just a little off. And finally, in Stay Illusion, her last collection, I don't even know how to really talk about this in any way that could do it justice. If you don't get any of her other collections, get this one. Like all of her collections, there is no doggerel, no dull poetry whatsoever. But this represents, to my mind, the crowning achievement, the peak, the apex of her prowess as a poet. As that phrase I read at the beginning of the video from this collection, sumptuous in emptiness, implies, Brock-BROIDO is attracted to grandeur, but she also is so aware of its ephemeral, fleeting quality. She loves life. She loves this material world, but she knows that it will come to an end. Throughout this collection, there are 2 lucid intervals, as they're titled, which that's a great way to then implicate the entire rest of the collection as dreams. Here we get salt, myth, medieval, death, dream, lions, birds, flowers, a catastrophe of hope, oblivion, and suicide. The very first line of the very first title of the very first poem are perfectly situated to set us up for this collection. The title is Infinite Riches in the Smallest Room, which reminds us of Hamlet saying, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space. And the very first line, silk spool of the recluse as she confects her eventual mythomania. A little later on, what if I were gone and the wind still reeks of hyacinth? What then? And it's telling that what then tagged onto the end terminates in a period, not a question mark. It can't be answered. And it's also as if she's asking, can we get any meaning anymore from the material world when we're gone? She perfectly captures the romantic's fate. My heart's desire would be only to desire, but not to grasp. To stay in the endless quest, to stay always wanting, never to move into the phase of desire fulfilled. Throughout these poems, we hear Kafka, Cortázar, Sebald, Shirley Jackson, Raphael Alberti, Mandelstam, and Treichel. I want to read the poem For a Clouded Leopard in Another Life in its entirety. You were a seed still in Darwin's left breast pocket, not imagined yet, almost invisible in the felt there just above his heart. The bluey nubbin sleeping in a child's unmarred arms. Things vanish in the morning when we wake like loam that only grows on buttermilk at night. In April, a tiny feline on the ledges of a billow cloud. Or like the finch let loose in the mossery, you were ended unexpectedly. What is only left of you is only me. And indeed, what is left of Lucie Brock-BROIDO? Only us, reading and experiencing and talking about her extremely accomplished poetry. I hope you too will seek out her poetry and savor them as I have.